My First Quilt Show is brought to you by Baby Lock, for the love of sewing. Aurifil, perfectly suited for every quilt project. Hovels, cut it close with Hovels. Omnigrid, providing quilters with specialty rulers and accessories for over 30 years. Riley Blake, colorful, playful, and sophisticated fabrics that can't help but bring a smile to your face.
Hi, I'm Sara Gallegos, and you're watching My First Quilt Show. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about things to look for when picking the perfect sewing machine. I'm working on the Baby Lock Lyric, which is kind of a midline machine and has lots of great features for quilting. And some of the things that I look for when picking a machine is to make sure I get something with a good assortment of stitches. I really like to do applique and use decorative stitches for bindings on quilts, so I like to pick a machine that gives me quite a bit of variety and assortment. And then you can play with decorative stitches for pieced blocks and just for accents too, and I absolutely love that. You also want to make sure that you get a machine that's easy to thread and operate. And I always encourage people to buy a machine from an authorized Baby Lock dealer so that you can make sure you get the service and support and lessons to learn how to use your machine. It's going to make your sewing that much more enjoyable. This machine is fairly easy to thread. You simply follow a numerical path. And when you're threading your machine, you want to make sure that you select a thread that's going to blend well with the fabrics that you're using. I'm using something high contrast so that you can see it on camera, but if you're working with something at home, use something neutral that's going to blend in with your fabrics. So I've threaded the machine with this red, and I've also wound a bobbin of the same thread. You are going to always get the very best results if you wind a bobbin that comes with your machine with matching thread. There are lots of different types of pre-wound bobbins out there. However, they are not perfectly sized and weighted for your machine. Only the bobbin that comes with it is. So for the very best results, you do want to wind your own bobbin, even if it's with bobbin thread, just to make sure that you've got the proper size of bobbin in. You also want to make sure that when you start a new project that you put a new needle in. It's very important to make sure that your needle is properly matched to the thread and the fabric that you're using. Typically when I'm piecing, I'll be using cotton thread or polyester and cotton fabrics, and I use an 80 or a 90 sized quilting needle. You can also use sharps needles, but you want to make sure that it's a new needle. The good rule of thumb to follow is about every 8 hours of stitching or with every new project, just put in a new needle. If you start finding that you're hearing funny sounds or getting skipped stitches or broken threads, it's a pretty good indication that it's time to change that needle. They are disposable, so you want to make sure that you keep a fresh one in when you're working on new projects. Now, some other features that I like on this machine for stitching is that it does have an adjustable speed control. If you're a new sewer, one of the things that it's good to make sure that you can kind of concentrate on is keeping consistent speed, especially if you're working with decorative stitches. Because if you have fast points and slow points, it can actually distort the size and how the stitch completes itself. So having adjustable speed control can help you if you tend to sew a little bit uneven on the speed. And it can also allow you to go a little bit slower for techniques like applique if you tend to be a bit of a lead foot like me. So it's nice to have adjustable speed control. I also like a built-in thread cutter, just a push button and my top and bobbin thread are cut. There is a thread cutter on the side of the machine, but I find that I waste a few inches of thread every time I take my thread to the thread cutter. So it's nice when you can just push a button and have it cut the thread for you. Another favorite feature of mine is pivot position. When I touch the pivot button, it activates that pivot function, and what's going to happen is every time I stop sewing, the machine is going to stop with the needle buried in the fabric, and it will lift the presser foot up for me, and that allows me to be able to maneuver my fabric or adjust the fabric under the presser foot if I need to. And then when I start sewing again, it automatically lowers that presser foot, and I can continue on. It's also really nice to be able to adjust the stitch that you're working with. Even if it's just a straight stitch, sometimes it's nice to be able to take that straight stitch from 2.5, which is a standard setting. You could take it down to 2 millimeter for a short stitch length, or if you're basting, you could take it out to 3 or 4 millimeter. So it's very nice to be able to determine how to adjust your stitch length. Adjusting your stitch width can also be important, especially if you're working with a decorative stitch and you want to change the size of it. And it would also move the position of your straight stitch within the needle opening of your presser foot. So it's nice to be able to make adjustments to that stitch length and width to be able to customize the type of sewing that you are working on. Now I have a 1/4 inch foot on my machine, and when I'm piecing, when you're quilting, you're pretty much always going to be using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So to have a foot that gives you that exact seam allowance is pretty helpful. There is a marking on the bed of the machine at 1/4 of an inch away from center needle position. And sometimes it's hard to follow that line as you sew. We tend to get a little bit crooked. So having a 1/4 inch foot that's got a guide on it, it's a little flange on the side of the foot. And as you stitch, you're going to run the edge of the fabric up against that flange, and it basically stops the fabric up against a wall. So you can't go too far outside of your 1/4 inch seam. It really makes it easier to sew straight and keep that consistent 1/4 inch seam allowance. You do sometimes also want to use what they call a scant 1/4 inch. And on my 1/4 inch foot, the hole for the needle is a little bit larger than some. And that allows me to be able to move my needle position 1 click to the right to get that scant 1/4 inch. Now, if you're working with a really fine thread like an Aurifil 50 weight, your thread's gonna lay right inside your seam and you don't even need to worry about a scant 1/4 inch because it doesn't take up any width whatsoever. It just lays right into your threads and into your fabrics as you stitch. So favorite foot, 1/4 inch foot. Now a lot of people talk about a walking foot. I don't find that on this machine I need to use a walking foot because I feel that it feeds the fabric very nicely from top and bottom. But if you're working with your machine and find that as you're piecing, one of your layers, top or bottom, is finishing faster than the other, so you have uneven pieces at the end of your seam, you might find that you want to attach a walking foot. You have a set of feed dogs underneath of your presser foot, and those move the fabric from front to back as you sew. That's their job. They're constantly walking along the bottom side of your fabric to move it out of the machine. With the walking foot, you have another little feed dog on top of the fabric, and it's going to move at the same rate of speed, pulling your fabric from front to back from both the top and the bottom to make sure that you have nice even seams. Again, I don't find that I need it on this machine. It does come with it, but I rarely use it. But it is an option for you if you're having a difficult time with that. So let's talk about a 1/4 inch seam. The first thing we need to do is pick a couple pieces of fabric here. And I have my 1/4 inch foot with guide, and I'm going to line up the edges of my fabric really nicely so it's nice and straight. So the raw edges of my fabric are perfectly aligned, and then place those underneath the presser foot and lower the foot. A little crooked there. And I've just made sure that the raw edge of my fabric is right up against the flange on the guide of my 1/4 inch foot. And now I'll stitch down the length of fabric. And stop and adjust my fabric as I go if I need to. So I'm at the end of my seam and I'll touch my scissor button. Cuts my threads for me. And now I can pull that away and see that I have a nice 1/4 inch seam allowance. And one of the things that you can use to verify that you have a 1/4 inch seam is a seam guide. And I know that this little marking here gives me a 1/4 of an inch from the edge of the guide to this little cutout right here. And I am actually just about 1/8 of an inch over to the left. So for a really precise 1/4 inch, I could maybe take my needle position 1 click to the right, and then try that again, and it should be the perfect 1/4 inch seam. So now I'll take a second set of fabrics here. And now that I've moved that needle position, we're going to stitch one more time. There we go, another seam. Get out my trusty seam gauge, and there we go. Now we're spot on. So I know that with this particular foot and my needle position moved 1 click to the right, I have the perfect 1/4 inch seam. So it's nice to have this little tool just to be able to verify your seam allowances on your machine, because it is going to vary from machine to machine. Now, as long as you're staying consistent with your seams, you're going to find that you have good success. Now, the next thing I want to show you is an adjustable seam guide foot. If you're still having a difficult time running your fabric up against the edge of that guide on the 1/4 inch foot, you could attach this little seam guide foot. It's got a real skinny edge here, and it actually works in tandem with this little ruler. You can stick this to the bed of the machine, and now you have an extension all the way to the end of the machine itself to run your fabric up against the edge, so you can really make sure that you're sewing straight as you go. So now that you've learned a little bit about 1/4 inch seams and features on machines, if you're looking for a new machine, be sure to visit your local Baby Lock dealer. Check out the decorative stitches and the stitch positions and have fun with the machine. And come back and see me again. Next week we're going to be working on 9-patch, simple blocks, and chain piecing.
My First Quilt Show is brought to you by Baby Lock, for the love of sewing. Aurifil, perfectly suited for every quilt project. Hovels, cut it close with Hovels. OmniGrid, providing quilters with specialty rulers and accessories for over 30 years. Riley Blake, colorful, playful, and sophisticated fabrics that can't help but bring a smile to your face.